Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. Before I introduce the episode, I want to read a portion of a listener's email. Nikki from the UK writes, "Hi, Peter. I hope you are well. I just wanted to say how much I'm enjoying your solo podcast. I've always been single and love my solo life. As a solo and an introvert, I've basically been rehearsing for lockdown most of my life. So despite everything going on, I'm blessed to be happy and coping well. Most of my friends are in miserable relationships, and it breaks my heart. I spend my time doing what I want when I want. I cannot imagine living any other way. I count my gratitudes every day for the lovely, stress-free life I lead. Coming across your podcast really brought joy to my day as I heard yourself and others revel in the splendor of the solo life and expressing thoughts I've had for years." Thanks so much, Nikki. I'm amazed by the number of emails, calls, texts, and DMs that I received. And I just want to say thank you to all of you and to Nikki for the encouragement. Now, this is the second part of my conversation with Amy Gahran, the author of Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Uncommon Love and Life. We delve more deeply into solo living as an alternative to the relationship escalator, and she helps me better define what it means to be solo. I'll give you a hint. The focus is on autonomy. To be autonomous whether you are single or partnered. And be sure to check out her website, offescalator.com, where she's conducting a new survey for her next project. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's return guest is Amy Gahran. Amy is a journalist, host of the blog solopoly.net, and author of Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Uncommon Love and Life. You can learn more about her book at offescalator.com and participate in a forthcoming survey for folks in unconventional relationships. She took part in a previous episode where we discussed the relationship escalator and alternatives to it. She returns to help me better define what solo living means. Welcome back, Amy.
Hi, Peter. Good to talk to you again.
First of all, for folks who haven't listened to part one of this, you need to listen to part one. There's so much good information in there. Whether or not you're interested in unconventional relationships or not, it's fascinating. I think it's liberating. There's a lot to learn, and Amy's book's outstanding. Now, I've been very focused with this This podcast is new, it's growing, it's fun. It has a nice little niche, which is this kind of positive view of single living. And I've been a lot more focused on the remarkable life side of the podcast. That is, I've been thinking a lot about what it means to live a remarkable life, the idea that there are multiple paths to living a remarkable life. And I've given a lot less thought to what it means to be solo. And you have a section in your book about autonomy, and you have an entire chapter dedicated to solo living. You use the term solo. I had not read your book when I had picked this term. And I find myself without a great definition, to be honest, because, for example, the idea is I have the term single person's guide to a remarkable life, but, for example, I have partnered listeners who have what they describe as a solo mentality. And I, of course, want to have a big tent. You know, I want this to be welcoming to lots and lots of people. I don't want it to feel exclusive in any way. Of course, I do want it to be positive. If you want to complain about solo living, you can go elsewhere. So, Amy, let's talk a little bit about the term solo, your use of it, and how it relates to some of the concepts in your book and elsewhere.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think it's worth differentiating between solo and single.
I think that's fair.
These are related concepts, but they are not complete synonyms. So in mainstream society, okay, so talking about, walking down the street and when you can go to a bar and talk to people in a bar, single usually means that you are not currently in any intimate sexual or romantic relationships that involve any particular ongoing nature or depth or commitment.
Okay.
So that you effectively, you might be casually, there's the casual serious dichotomy.
Yes.
You might be casually dating one or more people, but you're not serious with anybody yet. And that line between casual and serious is, or having no intimate connections at all, which many people choose not to, that's the single side of the fence. Okay, the not single side of the fence is if you have been seeing in an intimate relationship somebody for any length of time and there's depth of feeling, emotional commitment, that sort of thing. In mainstream society, that's where that line tends to get drawn. Solo is living life as an autonomous individual regardless of your relationship status. So you might be solo where you might have relationships that are really deep, that last for years, that last for decades, where you have willed your house to that person if you die, but you don't want to live with them while you're alive. And you don't want their name on the title while they're alive. You don't necessarily want to get legally married to anybody. You might not want to merge finances with them. You might not want to identify much as a couple. You can acknowledge you have this relationship and that this person is important to you and that they are a consideration and maybe even a priority for you, but you do not allow the considerations of that relationship to interfere with you making your own decisions about your life. It doesn't mean you don't care about other people, but it means that you make your own decisions about how your life works.
Yeah, okay. So what I hear you saying is like the solo, using the term solo, there may be overlap with being single, but it's not necessary. And
Correct.
It's kind of a mindset, and then also may find its way into behaviors, right? So I think about this too. Like I have people, in part one, we talked about being interviewed. You meet someone on an app, you meet for coffee or a drink, and you start feeling like these feel like interview questions rather than kind of get to know you questions. And for me, I've never lived with someone. There were a time, like I had one girlfriend, I'd moved in with her for a short period of time because I was doing a renovation, but it wasn't a traditional, like, we're moving in, we're, as you use the term, merging in our possessions and so on.
And there are a lot of people who are temporarily cohabiting right now because of social isolation and quarantine. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. And so, I might get asked, like, well, would you ever live with a partner? And my honest answer is, I can't say yes and I can't say no. I don't really have a strong desire to live with someone, but I'm not going to rule it out. But I also am not looking to do that. I'm not eager to do that in any way. And I think that's like an example of kind of my solo mentality, that even if I have someone I'm kind of very serious about, I still may not want them to live with me.
Would you evaluate the importance, commitment, depth, or value of a relationship based on whether it involved cohabitation?
Would I? No, I wouldn't, but I know that the world does.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. I don't think, I actually, I really respect when I come across people who are in relationships and they have different bedrooms or they may have different residents or whatnot. I find that exciting because I was like, wow, these are people who are doing something very clearly that works for them because they're going against the convention in such, in sort of such a striking way. I find it uplifting.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I understand that I'm not the norm. I think the average person might find that puzzling, even threatening, and certainly they might dismiss that relationship as not being as important or something like that. They say, you don't share a bed, you don't share a residence, how serious could they be?
Yeah. Or you might be in a relationship with somebody for years and they still don't get invited to family gatherings with you,
Yeah. I'll tell you how I know that I'm cut from a solo cloth. I definitely have had relationships where I've said, I'm not doing the holidays with you and your family. Like, I'm not going to do it. I don't do it with my family. I'm not going to start doing it with yours. And so, I recognize that's unusual, but like almost all of my Christmases are spent alone or maybe with one other person, for some, not in any sexual way, just like there happens to be someone I'm close with that we want to spend some time together. And so, I could see how problematic that would be for an escalator style relationship. So just to recap for people who haven't listened to part one, right? So the hallmarks of an escalator relationship are monogamy, merging of possessions, finances.
And identity.
Thank you. We're thinking of yourselves as a couple. A sexual romantic connection, some continuity or consistency, right? So this goes on without breaks and for the long term, and some hierarchical or some important status that this is set above other relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the bundle of social norms that defines how intimate, sexually or romantic intimate relationships are supposed to work and how they are supposed to be valued and viewed in society. It's not wrong. We deal with social norms every day. Social norms are not a bad thing, but in the case of something that affects such a deep intrinsically to an individual intimate part of who you are and how you connect with people and how you experience life, it can be a bundle of norms that may or may not work with how healthy relationships might look for you. Yes,
indeed. And it's the thing about it that I think is really striking is like these things are often like unstated. They're just assumed. It's just that, it's so common. It's so pervasive. It's so powerful.
And privileged.
Anything
that is normal is intrinsically privileged because how good does abnormal sound?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so when you step away from that, then suddenly there may be some risks associated with it. There may be some discomfort associated with it and so on. Now, what I want to do with solo, of course, is to push back against that stigma. That the idea that you're not on, whether you be single as in like you're living your casual existence
or no intimate relationships at all.
So that's kind of the way I have sort of thought about solo is you are not intimate or sort of casually dating and you're kind of comfortable and happy with that, whether it be for now or forever. So at some point you might want to be on the escalator. And as I like to say, more power to you. I wish you the best. What you're suggesting, which I like a lot, and which I'm so glad you introduced yourself to me, is that the mindset matters more than some, set of check boxes. And to your point is that you can have people who are partnered but have this sort of solo perspective. So you could be, what is it, partnered but living apart, or is there...
Living apart together is the term that's being more commonly used right
living
now.
Living apart together.
Partners, they're also called. Yeah.
Living apart together, that you might be living apart together and solo might be a place for you. A place to get information, a place to meet people, and so on. I'm talking about my podcast, not,
Yeah.
And I like that a lot. And so, Amy, make the case to me why I like that idea so much. Why should I like that idea so much?
Well, we live in a society that has a lot of very interesting contrasts in Western society. And one of the contrasts that is particularly interesting, especially in the United States and Canada and most of Western Europe and a lot of other Western societies as well, is the idea of the power of the individual, and that you are able to, make your own way in the world and make your own opportunities and figure things out. And that's supposed to be a great strength and a benefit of somebody's character. Yet when it comes to relationships specifically that involve sex or romance, if you don't eventually capture all that part of your identity and constrain it within one relationship, there's something wrong with you, that you are immature, uncommitted, a dilettante, a player, any number of variables there. And it's hard for people to, it's easier for men than it is for people who are not, specifically cisgender white men. Mm-hmm. It's easier for cisgender white men to come across as the confirmed bachelor and this is a good place in life. Everybody else is, well, too bad you didn't find somebody.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, one of the things that I noticed as I was doing, I call it my competitive analysis. When I looked at books and when I looked at podcasts and everything, the authors and hosts tend to be women. They tend to be focused on women for the reason that you just stated, which is the world's a lot harder on the ladies when it comes to embracing a single or solo lifestyle.
You get a different kind of pressure from the relationship escalator. The women, people who identify as women and who get read socially as women, often face a lot of pressure to get on the escalator because we are not supposed to be complete individuals without it. Okay? Men have a different kind of pressure. Cisgender men have a different kind of pressure. Is you get on the escalator because you need that domestic support.
Yeah, I always so the first one I've witnessed, that you're somehow incomplete, that you haven't done what you're supposed to do with life as a woman if you haven't climbed on the escalator, and especially if you fail to stay on it to the end, especially with having children.
Because any relationship that endures to a certain point and then doesn't endure past that point is a failure.
I know, it's terrible. It's so terrible.
Ending is equated with failure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so crazy. As a child of divorce, I'm so happy my parents got divorced. It was not a failure for them to get divorced. It was the best of all the bad decisions they could make. And so I really hate that idea that a relationship that ends is considered a failure, that ending is a failure. I was in an intimate relationship, the sexual and romantic relationship for 18 years, married for 12 of those years. And the best part of our relationship has been the last, 10 years or so 12 years now since we got unmarried. Yeah, I think that's great to hear.
And he just bought the house across the street from me too.
Yeah, that's outstanding. I love it. Yeah. And then on the side in terms of for men, I really dislike this idea that men can't take care of themselves, and they need a woman to either clean them up, or to settle them down.
Or to handle their social life and be their social manager, be their family manager, be their outsource emotional management for them as individuals. It really is it makes men look kind of pathetic. And if I were a guy, I'd be really pissed off about it.
I think it's a unfair stereotype of men. Now, of course, there is some truth to it, right? So I think what ends up happening is, and I think a lot of men in escalator relationships do themselves and their partner a disservice by going along with that. That is, that if you let your partner manage your social life, if you rely wholly on your partner for your emotional well-being.
If you don't have close friendships as an individual.
Yes. You are putting yourself at risk in a variety of ways. First of all, you risk your partner not respecting you, and no one wants to have sex with someone they don't respect. And so you risk being treated as another one of the
That's
children.
A kink, but yeah.
Yeah, so fair enough.
Okay.
But you risk being treated as another one of the children rather than as a partner. And I think that's really bad for relationships. It's bad for both people.
Yeah. And also people get sick, they die, they leave. If that relationship was to end for any reason, you have to still be able to function. And where's the rest of your support network?
Absolutely. I agree with that too. And it's unfair to that person to be your everything. And so to be a good partner is actually to diversify, and also at times it's good for a relationship to say no, to say, I don't like Sally and Joe. I'm not going to that dinner. I'm not going to do it. And no, the person may not be happy about it, but they're going to respect you, or at least they ought to respect you in the same way that you would respect their wishes if they say, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I like about this solo perspective, that it occurs even when you're partnered, is, and this may sound like a very simple thing, and is we might want a vacation separately. You know, even something like that, like for a typical relationship, even that idea could be very threatening. Mm-hmm. But for someone who
sleeping in separate bedrooms can be very threatening to some people.
Yes, that's right. I know, but I just like it so cold when I sleep.
Yeah.
I just want to get the temp. You know, I just want it freezing cold. Well, not all my partners want it freezing cold. You know, so I agree with you that having this sort of solo perspective is useful even within partnerships.
Yes, it is. But there is a difference between people who are in a nested or married relationship, but they have a more individual mindset, a more autonomous mindset, a solo mindset, versus people who have that solo mindset and are not in a nested or married relationship, in that you get treated very differently. You get perceived and treated differently, and that matters. The relationship escalator and your own personal identity about where you fall in various aspects of it are only somewhat up to you and your partners. A lot of it is also how you are going to be treated in society because of how people read you.
Okay, so so let's step back for a second. When you use the term nested, you're using it in a particular way, right?
Cohabiting. A cohabiting and usually financially entangled relationship. Yeah.
Okay, good.
You build a nest together, yeah.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is, imagine so you've got your singles, you know, the people that I initially thought of when I launched this podcast. And then what you're introducing is, no, Pete, you have other potential listeners to this, people who may be in partnerships of some, and we can get into this, of some variety. Mm-hmm. They have a solo mindset also, which is one of some individualism, this idea of, I forget exactly the term, not merging completely, right, in this way. But if you're nested, the world says that's okay. But you're not nested, the world says that's not okay.
It's kind of like, think about gender diversity. Somebody who is not cisgender, if they don't have breasts or wear prosthetics appearing to be breasts, it's a lot less likely that they will get read socially as a woman, and that's going to affect how they get treated.
Yes, I see what you mean. Mm-hmm. So that means that the someone who might be partnered but they're living apart, for example, they risk the stigma.
Yeah, and all that exists in a spectrum, like living apart. The people who live apart together, and don't see that as a transitional phase that eventually they're intending to overcome, but that's how it works for them. A lot of times their relationship gets denigrated as not quite as serious or committed.
I see. So to me, this is a difficult problem to solve, right? So there's two problems. There's the individual's problem, and then there's the societal problem.
Because we all exist in context.
Yes, indeed. So the individual one, I think, I will say I can speak from my own experience. I could not have launched Solo 10 years ago. In part, even though I needed it 10 years ago, but I didn't. I hadn't reached a sort of plateau where it came to comfort with my decision, with my preference, enough information to be able to talk eloquently about it with folks. And then, maybe the best way to say it is that I got to a place where I was never going to apologize for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize that some of this has to do with my own privilege in the world. I can acknowledge that as a straight white man and as a tenured professor and living in North America and so on and so forth, right? And living in 2020, right? How much harder this would have been. I actually have a podcast taping that I did that's very, very fun, which is people who should never have married.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea is, if this person were alive today, would they have not gotten married? You know what I mean? Because there was a time where the escalator was so much the norm. It was impossible to avoid it.
And even legally enforced. Look how difficult divorce was in the United States and a lot of other places for a long time.
Absolutely.
You raise an interesting point when talking about the solo mindset, even though you might be within a relationship, or perhaps more than one relationship at a time, intimate relationship, because monogamy isn't everybody's thing. And just because you're not monogamous doesn't mean you don't do love, commitment, mutual support, things like that. And I have two sweethearts. I'm polyamorous as well as solo, and I have two sweethearts, and both of them are also solo. One is poly, and the other is monogamous. And I was at his place just last night, actually, and we were talking. I said, "Hey, I'm doing this podcast for her," and he reiterated to me how he had a hiatus of almost a decade from dating after he had a his own bad experience with a relationship. And he was fine with that. He's like, I'm doing good on my own. And he had trepidation about embarking on dating again, in part because of the expectations of merging that most people have. Because he's worked really well and really hard to get a very good life for himself together. And when he finally decided he wanted to start dating again, and we started dating, he's like, "You don't want to live with anybody?" He's like,
yes!
And he's like, he had never really had a vocabulary for it. He thought that if he was going to be dating somebody, it would eventually end due to incompatibility.
Yeah, I think that's a common concern for folks who are interested in dating, are interested in being monogamous, being non-monogamous, whatever, being intimate with other people, is the worry that you are going to be, at some point, you're like, I'm going to disappoint this person because I'm not going to give them what they want, which is the full ride on the escalator.
Yeah.
I find this with myself a lot with the topic of children, because I'm very clear I don't want children. And so on date number one or prior to it, I say, I don't want to have children. And it's, I sort of brace myself for the person to say, well, I do, you know what I mean? Nice meeting you, take off, kind of thing. And it's always so refreshing if the woman across the table just reaches across and just high fives me, Yeah. Because it's just like, oh, there are other people who want the same thing that I do. It's just harder, it's just a smaller number. They're harder to identify. It's not as out in the open because it's non-normative, and so on.
And anytime it's not normative, people usually aren't going to volunteer that information, and they try to get at it sideways.
Yes,
and
code.
Yeah. So it's important to have your own vocabulary and to put yourself out there and realize that, especially with dating, it's not really a numbers game.
Yeah.
It's about establishing compatibility. And that's not even just about hunting for a sexual and romantic relationship that might be cohabiting, and you merge finances and you get married. Yeah, you can want all that. But with all the people you meet, however you encounter them, how are you compatible? What kind of relationship might emerge from what you each bring to the table? And you have a whole array of options. And all of those options are potentially valid and valuable and really fucking cool.
I agree with that. Now, one of the nice things, besides I was sort of talking about the benefits of having a desire for an unconventional relationship, is living in present day. Not only are things more kind of progressive and open to it, but technologically it's a lot easier to do now than ever. That is, like, you have apps that, so for example, OkCupid has many more categories of how someone may identify and what it is that they want, versus like a very simple menu that you might get on Bumble or something else like that. Mm-hmm. And even the emergence of, and these, I think they're much more common in big cities, an app called Feeld, F-E-E-L-D, mm-hmm. Which is very sex positive. And so people are able to express, desiring a polyamorous relationship, non-monogamous relationships, various kinks that they have, and so on. And so this intersection of, people starting to figure out that the escalator is imperfect for many people. B, sort of just this kind of creeping recognition that there are other options out there and that they're okay and acceptable. And then plus the technology makes it a better time, a better time to be stepping off the escalator, I think. Yeah,
it does bring more people into your field of contact. Technology mm-hmm. does potentially increase your ability to come into contact with people. But, I'm 53 years old. I've been on these apps for a long time, and I have gotten kind of jaded about the way that most dating apps have gone, because it's because they're predicated upon the idea that dating is this certain thing that leads to a certain goal, either sex or to, an escalator style relationship.
Yes.
And, like I said, all kinds of connections matter and are valid. And you have to be open to really appreciating the value that you can find in friendships, that you can find in family, that you can find in mentorships and community. And I think people who are solo, especially if they do not happen to have a relationship that might be read socially as you are partnered up, mm-hmm. have to work harder and more consciously to build those connections and nurture them, because we don't live in a society that supports them.
I agree. I talk about having a team. I like that. I use that metaphor that I think everybody should have a team, but I think if you're solo, it's especially important to have a team, and you have to work to cultivate that. As you were, I would add also professionals to the list that you just had. Mm-hmm. So that is a therapist, a good doctor, a financial planner / accountant, et cetera.
Good editor.
A good editor. I could use a good editor. But yeah, you know what I mean? So you have this sort of group of people, as you said, friends, mentors, and colleagues, and so on, that frankly make for a more rich existence. Mm-hmm. Not only is it a diversified existence and one that has optionality, but it's just like, boy, you can learn a lot from 25 different people more than one person. Mm-hmm. One intense person versus 25 people. I'll take the 25 a lot of the time. For me, I think I noticed what helped me become more comfortable with my soloness is that I started to realize how happy I was when I was unpartnered. that is, that being partnered wasn't...
Did you have a light bulb moment for that, or did it kind of creep up on you?
I think it kind of creeped on me, but what had ended up happening was I ended up having a pretty bad breakup and what predicated the breakup was my disinterest in children, her interest in children. It stopped us in our tracks, even though,
Well, it's a pretty big one.
It's a big one, and as it should be, And I had been honest about it, but we had still pursued the relationship even with that incompatibility. And as I was kind of grieving and recovering from that, one of the things that I realized was the world I was going back to, my single world, was rich in experiences. I enjoyed my day-to-day. I was healthy. I didn't need a partner to solve any major problems in my life. Like, I didn't need what I would call like a utilitarian partnership, right? Like, I could pay the bills on my own. I could do laundry. I could feed myself. I had great friendships. I had this engaging career. It wasn't, it was like, oh, I don't need this other thing. And that was really liberating to have. And so then when people were just like, well, Pete, I'm worried about you, I was like, you should not worry about me. I'm doing great. This is going to be good.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. For me, I had, first of all, I'm fifth out of 6 kids, grew up in a crowded house, and then I moved from there in with my boyfriend at the time, who I later married. And so went right into living with somebody and did that for quite a long time, the better part of 2 decades. And then when we got unmarried, I moved in for a couple of years with a friend and was living in a friend's house. She was renting me one of her spare rooms. And that was really good until I could live with her great. I couldn't live with her boyfriend. And so I got my own apartment for the first time in my life at 42 years of age.
I see.
And no, 43 actually. And I went in there thinking, I'm going to feel so lonely. I'm going to feel so lonely. And the second week I was there, I had made plans for every evening of the week. I was going to go out with somewhere. And one night my plans didn't fall through, and I was just sitting there bracing myself saying, this is it. This is where the loneliness is going to hit. And
it didn't
poured
hit.
A glass of wine and sat down and started reading a book. I'm like, well, this pretty much rocks. And it's like, it hit me. It's like, I'm not going to be lonely. I can do this.
Yeah, I think one of the big insights in the loneliness research, which I think is really important, is that being lonely and alone, being alone is not always a predictor of loneliness. You can be coupled and lonely. You can be lonely in a crowd.
I never felt lonelier in my life than when I was trying to be monogamous, and I was married and living in a house where we just didn't live together well.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get back to you because you're such an interesting case study in solo living. So you identify as solo poly, and then you have a partner who is solo poly and monogamous.
Yes, and another one who is solo and also, no, he's solo and considers himself monogamous. He has no desire to have another sexual or romantic relationship other than with me.
Okay.
At least right now, but he seems pretty set in that. And then my other sweetheart is poly, and he has another partner as well.
Okay. So, by the way, I love the term sweetheart. I think that's really, it's great.
Well, and the thing is when people say partner, they automatically assume a lot of that merging and entanglement. And it's like, yeah, no, that's not what really seems pertinent to our relationship.
Well, I like the term too because like lover is not a good term. There's a boyfriend, girlfriend. There's a lot of like imperfect terms. And one thing that's nice about sweetheart is it's just so positive.
Yeah, it is.
It just expresses such affection.
And it is gender neutral, and it works. I mean, they were wonderful guys, both of them.
That's great. I think that's lovely. So I want to wrap up by revisiting a couple things from your book where you talk about solo. And I can't, these are probably your words. So these are your words. You talk about prioritizing personal autonomy. And you were saying this earlier, like how, especially in the United States, this very strong focus on the individual and independence and liberation, and it's such. It's what's that?
At least for men.
At least for men, and then at some point though, the world goes, no, it's time to settle down, right?
There's a built-in tension there.
Yes, there is a built-in tension there. Like, it's fine up into a certain point. And now I wrote this down. Now, I don't know if these are my words or your words, but prefer not to have someone's permission to make life choices and don't want to make other people's life choices.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, right? Like that sort of solo mentality is, I like to use the term do no harm. I think, like, to be an ethical person, like, I don't want to do harm to anyone else. But I also like the fact that I get to make my choices. And that I think that the typical escalator relationship, you give up a lot of that autonomy. Now there's someone else who's either making choices for you or has a lot of say in terms of your choices.
Mm-hmm. And for instance, my poly sweetheart, the very first conversation I had with him was, wow, so you're planning to retire to Ecuador. How cool. I'm not retiring to Ecuador, but that was a great thing for us to talk about. And I know he's going to do that someday. And that's not going to be the end of my relationship with him. I'll just have somebody to visit in Ecuador.
Yeah, that's right. Cool. Yes. Yeah. And that's nice that you didn't immediately code that as being very threatening to your partnership.
No. No, we're sticking by each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that, your contention that like sort of the solo mentality is independent of relationship status. I like that idea a lot. And I like that it's a bigger tent. And I like what it really gets down to is the heart of this idea, which is maintaining some autonomy provides opportunity. And then of course the logical extension of this, which is we have one life. Let's make the most of it. Let's make it the best that we can make it.
And there's also the practicality. Put on your own oxygen mask first before attempting to assist others. I use that all the time. I think that if you can there's this great irony that if solo is successful as a podcast, you have this group of people who become better and better people. That is, they become healthier, they become happier, they're living more robust life, they're living on their edge, they're stretching themselves. And you know what? Those become very appealing people to have sex with, very appealing people to spend time with. And so the idea of essentially having this kind of more independent view of your life can provide you opportunity to become a better person. And then if you want a partner or not, you can do that. It actually becomes easier to do, which I think is really quite nice. Yeah.
So as you're sort of reflecting on our conversation, Amy, what is it do you think that we're missing? Are there how do you think about the benefits and costs of sort of solohood? You tackle this in your book. You address some of those, no?
Yeah, I mean, there are practical implications, social implications, relational implications, and on the practical side, for instance, I just finally in the last few months got my act together and did all my end of life paperwork. Ah,
good for you.
And that was a really interesting exercise because I'm not only unmarried and not living with any partners. I have 2 housemates, but, they're housemates. But I have no children. And under legal defaults, if I was to drop dead before I had gotten those papers done and notarized and filed in the right places, everything would have gone to my next of kin. Now, I love my family of origin. I really do. But I want to leave my house to my former spouse.
Okay.
And he has similar plans that, if something happens to him. And that's something we decided we wanted to do to create a little bit of infrastructure, for each other. That doesn't mean we can't change our minds about that at some point. But so far, that's what we want to do. I also needed to think more specifically about who would be making medical decisions for me.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, because I live geographically far away from my family of origin. I am no longer married to my former spouse, and I actually wouldn't want my former spouse to be the person making medical decisions because I think he would be so emotionally wrought in a situation if I was incapacitated or facing death.
I see.
I didn't want to put that on him. And I have one of my sisters is an RN, and one of my soul sisters, one of my dear friends here in Colorado, is extremely capable and clear-headed in any kind of crisis. And I was able to have a very clear conversation with my friend saying, would you be willing to be in this role for me?
I see.
And she was like unhesitatingly. So my soul sister, my friend here locally, is my first medical power of attorney. And then the backup is my sister, who's the RN, because I wanted to select the people who I trusted enough and was closest to, but would be the right person to make that decision. Mm-hmm. If you don't have escalator relationships, and if you don't have good relationships with your family of origin, legal defaults are really going to screw you on end-of-life stuff.
Indeed, yeah. I think it's useful for me to hear this because I have my sister gets everything, not just because we didn't get along as kids, but my sister gets everything. But when it comes to making decisions, she's far away. This is something I should be thinking about, like who might be the person who's close by, who would be useful in a situation like that. And
I, in the process of doing that, I've been talking to a lot of my friends and helping them through this because with COVID-19, everybody is thinking about this stuff now. And a lot of people are like, I don't know who I would ask to do that,
Yeah.
And it gets complicated with COVID and relationships where people are living together because it's likely that you both might have it at the same time.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So you might want to think about having somebody else who would make those decisions. Anyway, long way of saying that being solo, I am used to thinking through those situations.
Right.
And having those conversations. And having conversations about mutual support with people. And I don't just assume that somebody I might be having a long-term, ongoing, intimate sexual relationship with might want to have anything to do with, say, my family of origin or my other friends. We negotiate these things. Mm-hmm. And that is okay. And frankly, anybody who would think that is weird is not really compatible for much of any kind of relationship with me.
Yeah, I can see that.
It gets to be intrinsically, the ability to have those conversations and to negotiate any kind of relationship is itself a really damn good filter.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that one of the great benefits is there's a level of authenticity that comes with embracing one's desire for autonomy. Mm-hmm. Like that you get to be your full self. It may be difficult in some ways, right? Because it's outside the norm, but at least you get to be the person that you feel like you're meant to be.
I don't necessarily think that people who ride the relationship escalator and get coupled up in a very enmeshed way are necessarily excluded from being their full and complete selves. I think that's a really valid approach to life, and it works really well for people. But I think that if you think that's the only path to happiness and fulfillment and realization, you're missing a big option that you really should at least consider.
I agree. But I'm saying like the person who, to their core has this solo mentality and then they try to do the relationship escalator. That's unfortunate for both them and for their partner, like I think that's.
Yeah, but a lot of people do it and then they figure out late in life that that's not what they want to do. And then things fall apart for a while, but then usually they start to figure things out a little bit better after that.
Yeah, so the last thing I want to talk to you about is this idea of later in life. So I think, and this just might be that I'm getting older, and maybe the world is changing at the same time, but my sense of a solo lifestyle is that it gets easier as you get older. And let me make the case and hear what you think about it. So one is as you start to move away from childbearing years, sometimes there's sort of less pressure for a more conventional kind of relationship, whether it be for yourself because you want to have kids or for someone who, for who you're looking for in a partner. Then also, as you go on in life, people are more likely to have tried the escalator and it didn't work. So they're now divorced and they are reluctant to do it again. They're like, okay, I tried that didn't work. Maybe there's some other way to go about doing this. And so with experience, without like the immediacy of getting married and having kids because of some window of time that's optimal, and then just the fact that people have enough experience with the escalator to know that it's imperfect, or at least it's imperfect for them. Is that your sense also?
Yes and no. I mean, I have a very broad social circle that spans a very wide age gap. I have friends in their early 20s, okay, and friends who are in their 70s. Okay, so I think to some extent it depends on how vulnerable somebody feels socially or logistically.
Okay.
Okay, so for instance, people who may be poor, yes, people who might have a chronic illness, people who might be living in an area where the local culture is not just couple-centric, but just really punishes people for not, yes, being coupled up. I think it's harder to come to that realization at any point in life because it gets so ingrained on you that being solo is simply not safe.
Yeah, it's not an option. I recognize, yeah. Marriage for so many years in history was this utilitarian thing. Mm-hmm. It served these other purposes besides, the idea of soulmates and romance and so on. It was a way to survive. Mm-hmm. And that continues today, there's all these jokes about the divorce rate going up because of the pandemic. On the other hand, because of all the economic problems, people don't get divorced. Correct. When there's recessions and so on. Yeah. And so I recognize the difficulty in deviating depending on your circumstance.
Assuming that it's not a matter of feeling safe, assuming it is just a matter of choice, and that you have the economic means to live independently, which does not necessarily mean living alone. For instance, yes, I have 2 housemates. The reason I was able to buy a house as a longtime self-employed, single, logistically single woman, was that housemates were in my business plan, and the housing market in the Boulder area, yes, so that was not going to be a problem getting housemates here. But so provided, and this is and I state this because don't overlook it, because so many people are logistically on the edge right now, more so than ever before. But provided that it is safe and feasible for you to be solo, I do think it is easier to approach it after you've had a lot of life experience, not necessarily because people might not have been intrinsically solo earlier in life, but that is so much social reinforcement that couplehood is what you really want. I mean, Disney, for Christ's sakes. Yeah. And it's very hard to imagine your own path to happiness. It is so much more tempting to want to be led to it. Yeah. And it can seem daunting to find your own path, even though that's the striking out on your own is romanticized. The feasibility that's putting one foot in front of the other and figuring out your own damn self and your own damn life can feel really daunting, and it can be tempting to hook onto the illusion that somebody else can do that for you and that there is a preset path that is probably going to work. But really, it all just comes down to the people involved, to the individuals involved. And I think sometimes you have to bump your head up against life enough times.
That's well said. Yeah, that's well said. I actually, as I'm reflecting on my argument, I even am not sure I agree with it. Because one of the things that's really striking about young people today is they are first of all, much more aware of the alternatives than our generation. And, even there's evidence that, 25% of millennials will never marry. There's some Pew Research study that suggests this, which is a much higher rate than ever before, and so on. And so, maybe age doesn't matter or experience doesn't matter as much. But I think you're right that one of the things that does matter is experience and mentors and exemplars and and so on. And so it's why your book, for example, is so important, because it may not be a how-to book, but it is one that demonstrates the vast variety of options that people have, and the fact that there are people who are living those options incredibly happily.
Mm-hmm.
And
or not sometimes, but yeah.
Well, of course, yeah. No, I know. But the potential for happiness is there, there for them. And so, my hope with this podcast is it just gets a conversation going, gets people to go, oh, wow, there are other people like me. Oh, it's okay to think this way. Oh, I can start to learn how to navigate this.
Yeah, and it can make it, it also helps make the world a safer place for everyone. Because even if what you want is a very traditional life and to be very coupled up in a very merged relationship, if you want to ride the relationship escalator all the way, that's great. But you can learn how not to stigmatize people for doing other things.
That's a good point. The flip side of this, for the, for the relationship escalator folks who may have stuck around to the very end.
We didn't scare them off yet?
It is good to remind people that, yes, this may be different, but it's not, there's no valence to it. It's not wrong.
My mono sweetheart often goes with me when people get together in person there's a very good weekly polyamory meetup in the Boulder area.
Okay.
And it's a facilitated discussion, and then it's followed by social time at a local pub. And he likes to go to that, even though he's not poly himself. And it's not because he's dating a poly person. He's like, people talk about basic relationship stuff. They get together, and it's like, how do you resolve disagreements, and how do you talk about boundaries, and he's like, people just don't do this, and I'm like, rock on, dude.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think one of the things that is I find so exciting about solo living, about consensual non-monogamy, about polyamory is the need for honesty. And how important it is to be able to communicate.
Yeah, and negotiate.
And negotiate. And I think that that's really refreshing. It's something that escalator relationships don't always do. And I think that you can live your best life when you can approach it from a place of authenticity, honesty, and be willing to ask for what you want.
Mm-hmm. And especially as times get hard and circumstances change and life throws you curveballs, all those skills you have for supporting yourself, supporting others, and for negotiating and adapting to situations and finding your own feet under you will serve you well. And right now everybody is getting a big old dose of chaos. Indeed they are, yes. Yeah.
Amy, thank you for joining me for part 2. This has been as good as I thought it would be. I'm going to send people to offescalator.com.
Correct.
And
I'm about to launch a new survey for the second edition of the book. I'm doing some additional research, and it's specifically about how this time of chaos is affecting people's relationships.
I think that's great. Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for all you do. I really appreciate you reaching out. This has been really fantastic. I've learned a lot. And so,
well, if you come back to Boulder, we'll hang out.
That would be great.
Okay,
I would enjoy that. Thanks again for your time. Cheers.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.